Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Remember how we made those cast sugar urns a couple of videos back? Well, I've got another cast sugar video for you here today. This one's perfect for New Year's, maybe even a wedding, because I'm making cast sugar bells. And I've got two smaller versions. Well, these are two real-life versions, true-to-life versions here up on top of these tall containers because I've got some extensions on them, both royal icing extensions and frosting sheet extensions that if I were to lay them flat on the counter, they would mess up. So I'll be working with them largely elevated like that, and when we're ready to hang, then they'll be picked up off of those containers. So just in case you're wondering what that contraption is all about. So this is cast sugar. Just as a reminder, cast sugar is basically just sugar and water, and it hardens when it dries. It hardens kind of rock solid. So it's great for sculptural elements, for both party favors, singular decorative elements, or for sculptural elements on cakes. But, though theoretically edible, it's not so palatable. So these are largely for decorative purposes. I talked in my other video about how to cast sugar containers that have cavities in them and how to create little windows. This is in effect a window in the top, except a very small one. It's a hole I created in order to allow the clacker or the bell to be strung through later. So you want to refer back to that video to understand how I cast this piece. I will say that you can make these bells any which shape. I cast this in a little wine glass. You just want to make sure that the opening of the glass is wider, than anything that follows through so that the sugar can fall out. So this was done in a wine glass. This was done in another form of cup. But while the sugar was wet, I just plunged a 1/4 inch pastry tip in the top, cut about 1/4 of an inch in, so that when I did carve out the sugar, I was able to pop out that hole and I was left with a hole for stringing. This was another little liqueur glass or something of that sort. So get creative with your containers at home. I'm not going to show you how to cast that. You will just need one kind of cast bell piece with a hole on the top, and you'll need for this project 2 to 4 what I'm calling bell clacker pieces, the clangers, the things that hang at the bottom. These are cast sugar as well, but they're cast in silicone molds, and they have some royal icing appliques and royal icing work that was done to detail them. I'm just going to show you quickly how I cast those because I don't think I covered that really adequately in my earlier video. And again, just as a reminder, cast sugar is basically a mixture of granulated sugar, about 1 cup, in a ratio to 1 tablespoon of water. So it becomes a moist packing consistency like so. I had 2 molds, silicone molds, and you'll find the sources for these in my video description. And basically you take that wet sugar. This is the same process for making the bell. I'd just be packing a bigger container with it and then hollowing it out. Here we're not hollowing this piece out. Okay, and before I invert this, I want to take off that extra sugar that's sort of around the leaf. Otherwise we'll have a messy looking leaf at the end of the day. So I just kind of brush away the extra. And this doesn't need to be any higher than the height of the silicone mold, really. I should be doing this over a bowl because I'm just going to have to clean this up before we move on to the next step. Also, a brush comes in handy here to kind of clear edges, to make them a little cleaner on something that has a very variegated edge like this. Okay, I think I'm ready to invert it, and I like to do that on a parchment-lined piece of cardboard so there's a little support and I can move it out of the way. And I flip it directly like so. And then I find with most silicone molds it's helpful to kind of roll them back to reveal the sugar, like so. Now this piece, before you could lift it up, would have to dry overnight probably, and then it becomes something that I can move and shape and form with, though very, very fragile. With these, again, packing a wine glass, you'd invert it much the same way. You'd set it for about 3 hours, and then you'd carve out the interior, then you'd let it dry completely overnight, and you'd be ready to decorate. Okay, we've got our cast sugar piece. I am going to be decorating this with a number of different types of appliques. I've been doing a lot of appliques lately, ever since the perfume bottle. I'm just kind of on a roll with that. So I'm just going to show you a different application here using both sparkly frosting sheets and royal icing transfers. The bell that I'm going to try to mimic is the one that you see over here. It's got gold sparkly cutout frosting sheets as the larger elements, and then the blue and light purple elements and the little white beads are all royal icing transfers. I've got a whole nother video on how to make those. So first off, I want to start with the big anchor pieces, which are these gold frosting sheets. Frosting sheets come in matte finishes, plain, colored, and also this fun gold and silver sparkly finish, which I love for the holidays. I created this fun shape by using my craft paper punch and just punching it out, and I've done that in numerous other videos. So I'm going to be placing 4 of those along the edge such that they hang down slightly. Which is why I have it elevated on this piece, because if I were working on the work surface, the frosting sheet would be damaged by that. So I'm going to be just applying a little bit of corn syrup to kind of the upper half of this frosting sheet to lay it in place. The corn syrup here acts as my glue. It's a little thinner than royal icing, so a thin frosting sheet like this won't look as lumpy. If I were to use royal icing, chances are it would lay a little lumpier on the sugar here. So easy sticking process. I'm going to repeat that 4 times. I think I can get 4 of those all the way around if I've situated that properly. And the key here is just making sure they're all at the same orientation, because I'm trying to make this look symmetrical, as if there's a little flare to the bell. This will be like the little ruffle or flare at the end of the bell. And when you get too much corn syrup on this parchment paper you're working on, that's the time to turn to a new piece of it, so you don't get corn syrup on the top of the frosting sheets you're working on. I think that's about the same height, so I'm going to press it down. Look at it from this side. Seems okay. Let me just do a visual, make sure these others are going around in the way I expected. Before I anchor them, I just want to make sure they're equally spaced. They seem to have a lot more room back here, so I'm gonna peel this one off and just shift it over a little bit. I have a little room to move before the corn syrup dries to make sure that things are equally spaced. Okay, I've got the 4 frosting sheets down. I had a little latitude while the corn syrup was still wet to shuffle them around in case they weren't equally spaced and equally dropped, but I think they look pretty good. So now I'm going to go ahead and apply the royal icing transfers. The first ones I'm going to put down are these lavender ones, and these are ovals. These are a traced royal icing transfer, which I talk about in my part 2 video, how to create trace shapes. And these are were lavender that I then airbrushed with a little bit of pearl sheen, which is why they've got that nice shimmer. I'm using royal icing glue, thick consistency. I'm going to anchor one just below that center point on each daisy. So it's still hanging on the sugar, but kind of resting on the paper underneath. And we're going to put actually 6 of those down, 1 on each daisy and then 1 in between. Again, I'm just mimicking the piece in front of me. You could decorate these any which way, so get creative. And I'm constantly looking at it as I go to make sure things are symmetrical, or symmetric as the case may be. Whoops, I glued that a little too high. I'm just being careful not to tear the paper because it is fragile, and I could rip it if I plunge something into it. Actually, this is a good idea to do before all the purple are down to make sure they're anchored where I want them. And if I have a little extra icing showing, that's when my trussing needle comes in. I've got a little sticking out here that I want to get off. I'll just knock that off. Okay, so I've got the frosting sheets and my lower level of royal icing transfers on. For this particular design, I use another type of applique. It's a fondant applique. So these are strips or ribbons of rolled fondant, and I have a whole other video about how I cut them. Thin ribbons. And I'm just going to lay at the top to give a little bit more relief. Everything's laying pretty flat, and I think that the reason I chose fondant here is just because it gives a little more depth to the top of the bell. Now, to apply the fondant, you could stick these down with corn syrup, but I oftentimes just work with loose royal icing. You can get away with royal icing here because these pieces are thicker. Any lumpiness with it is less likely to show. I guess I have a slight preference for gluing down with royal icing when I can, because I think it dries faster than corn syrup, and so things are less likely to shift around on me. I'm cutting, at the top with a paring knife rather than pulling, because you will stretch the fondant if you just try to pull it off, the extra off. I'm going to put 8 down. So I've got 4 daisies, but I've got a pattern of 8 because I put the beads every other daisy. So I'm going to put a strip at the top of every bead, basically. While this fondant is still wet, I'm pressing a little one in at the end of each of these ribbons just to finish it off. Unfortunately, my transfers are all a little different sizes here. I didn't do a good job of picking the like-sized ones, so forgive me if they're a little bit different sizes. But I like it because it just kind of finishes off the end of that ribbon a little more neatly. Now, when I have so much on the bell now, at this point I got to be careful. I need to hold on to the bell as I press these pieces in, because I don't want it toppling off the top of this. But I need to be careful not to press into a freshly laid decoration in the back or I'll smudge it. So I'm going to try to push that a little higher up. So I'm going to be putting little teardrops in between them at the top as well, just to finish off the top. And then the last step we'll be putting on purple beadwork, just to accentuate some of the patterns that we've already laid. I like to get these pieces in while the fondant's still a little flexible, because if I need to push it in, you know, it will bend as opposed to breaking. When it dries, it'll break. One thing to note is you want to make sure those ribbons don't occlude or close off the hole at the top, because we're going to need to string that clacker or the ringer through the top. So it looks good. I just think it needs a little more, so I'm going to put some dots on it, my favorite. Plus they're easy to pipe on the sides of these contoured objects. Now, one thing I didn't mention at the beginning of the video is how would you use this? As I said, they're largely decorative because, though theoretically edible, they do dry quite hard. And they also are pretty heavy. So I wouldn't hang this on my tree, but what I'm going to do is make a bunch of them and hang them over my table at holiday time, and just for my chandeliers, and just kind of create a really sort of beautiful over-the-table vignette. Okay, so I'm going to add a few more dots, some big ones at the top of each of these white beads, and some little ones that track the outline of the frosting sheet, because I just want to accentuate that a little bit. It's a little hard to see because it's kind of pale against the pale sugar. Again, I'm working with icing of a beadwork consistency, which is relatively loose. It forms a nice bead on its own. Trying to pipe as perpendicular to the surface as possible to ensure a nice round bead. And I like to be as eye level as possible. This is a little low for me right now, so I may need to elevate it as I move to some of the lower parts on the bell. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to also put a nice purple dot down here. This is about as low as I'm going to pipe, so if this goes well, I should be in good shape. I'm really not pushing hard here because I just applied these transfers and I don't want them to fall off. So just letting the icing make contact with the transfer. I just think that gives it a little more pop and accentuates some of the pattern we've laid. Again, I think that just sort of helps highlight the shape of the wafer paper cutout, or frosting sheet cutout, which is kind of pretty. Okay, so I've got little purple dots everywhere, and I decided to put them around the big blue beads as well, just so I have an exact replica of the one down there. Okay, I'm going to set that aside to dry. You want that completely dry before you string it with the clacker. And in the meantime, we'll put the clacker together. That uses a sandwiching technique that I use a lot in sandwiching cookies together, except we're going to be placing these sugar pieces that I made before back to back. You saw how I molded those before. I've added some royal icing transfers to these just to jazz them up a little bit as well. And then you just want to cut a piece of ribbon that's going to be long enough to hang to what you ultimately want it hanging from. So this is pretty long because, as I said, I'm going to be hanging it from my chandelier. And you want a piece of nice flat ribbon so that it doesn't add too much girth to the bell piece here. I don't want it to see a big gap between these pieces once they're sandwiched together. So I'm working on bubble wrap again, not to disrupt the decorations on the other side. I put a little royal icing glue down. Then I'm going to lay the ribbon. This is the sandwiching element of it, kind of sandwiching things one against the other. Then a little more royal icing. I probably don't need that much because I don't want these to stick that far apart. And I'm going to sandwich the other element on top. This is exactly what I did to string together the jewelry in that jewelry video. So I'm adding another round element at the top. Again, this was a molded piece using a mold from First Impressions molds. And I'm just sandwiching the sugar element right above it. I want it flush up against that bottom piece, so I'm just pulling the ribbon a little bit taut. And I would allow that to dry several hours until completely dry. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to come back to the bell that we were just working on and string it with a clacker that I previously put together, just to show you how that's done. So I'm back. Here's one I previously put together. You can see once the royal icing dries, it is like glue. So it hangs nicely. You still have to be careful with it because the sugar elements are fragile. This one's a little different than the one I put together before. The sugar color was tinted tan in one of the elements before, and here it's all white. So now the depth of my bell is about 2 inches, so I want to tie a knot, a pretty hefty knot, no more than 2 inches here. This knot is what's going to catch the underside of the bell and prevent this from falling through, if you will. So I'm going to tie a bunch of knots here. Carefully, I do this with it generally lying down so I don't break the sugar. I'm just going to do several on top of each other. You know, alternatively, you could wrap tape around here to make that a bigger obstacle to getting through the hole. One other thing I like to do, and this also, if the knot isn't big enough, this is just an additional safeguard that will prevent the clacker from slipping through the bell, is I like to string it through a little bit of, this is a piece of cardboard that I just punched a small hole in, and I'm just going to string it through there. This also helps larger bells kind of lie more level on the string. Okay, so I've got that together, and this is the bell we were just working on. It's barely dry, so this may be a challenge to lift up without smudging decorations, but you'll get the gist of it. At this point, I just want to lift it off its support and string this through the bottom. You want to lift it off the support, and then you just want to feed the ribbon through the top. Okay, so I've got it strung through. And now just carefully pull it up. You don't want that cardboard hitting that fragile frosting sheet edging until it comes to the top. If you don't want the little fondant ribbons and so much of the hole showing, one other element that you can add, which I've done on most of my bells, is to create a little fondant disc. This one is just cut with a fluted round cutter and stamped with a rubber stamp to create that purple pattern. Dried, and then I string that on the top, and that's just a nice finishing accent, I think. And there you have it, a finished Happy New Year's bell made of cast sugar. If you haven't seen my other cast sugar projects, please go on over to my cast sugar urns. And until next video, Happy New Year and live sweetly.